Okay, well, I think it is just a little past 9:30. If you need a handout, Carol's got them, so just raise your hand if you've missed them. And let's begin. This morning we're going to finish up Genesis this morning, and we've got 9 chapters to do. So, yes, I thought this was actually going to go on for a couple more weeks, and it isn't, so we're going to get done with Genesis today. I summarized a lot of it in the handout that you've got, so I think we'll get through it just fine. What you might want to consider is when we get to the end of this, we'll leave some time for discussion, but what I would like to discuss is what are the takeaways from Genesis? What does one learn to apply to your life today? Because Genesis is a story that takes place 4,000 years ago. And the stories that you go through, how do they apply to us today in 2023? And there are some applications. We do learn some stuff from Genesis. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you again for bringing us together this morning to sit at the feet of your word and to contemplate, to discuss, to think through this story of Genesis, an incredible story about beginnings. Not just the beginning of the universe, but our faith beginnings and how you continue to work through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the rest, all the way to us. We thank you for that. We ask you to continue to open up to us this morning as we talk about Joseph and his family, the message that it brings into our lives today. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so a little bit about where we're at. We left this story with Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers. He is taken to Egypt. He is sold to a man by the name of Potiphar. Interestingly, he will marry a woman in Egypt that the father's name is very similar to this. And in fact, in some cases, it may actually be a very similar spelling. He's accused of sexual assault by Potiphar's wife. He is thrown into prison, and then he demonstrates his dream interpretation skills by interpreting the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, which actually come true in a very short period of time. And he tells the cupbearer, remember, when it all happens, tell Pharaoh about me, because he wanted out of prison. Well, cupbearer didn't do that. So today we're going to get through these 9 chapters. I've summarized them, and I believe we can do this and still have time at the end for some discussion. Chapter 41 is about Pharaoh having a dream, 2 dreams, in fact, a couple of years later. And oh, by the way, the cupbearer will remember Joseph. Chapter 42 is about the famine hitting, and then Jacob sending the brothers to Egypt to buy some food because they had stores of food thanks to Joseph. Chapter 43 is about the brothers having to go back to Egypt to get more food because they ran out. The famine was that severe. And it was a famine that actually impacted the Middle East, not just Egypt or not just Canaan, but it was the Middle East. It must have been very, very severe. In chapter 44, the brothers, Joseph recognizes who they are, but he accuses them of stealing. In chapter 45, Joseph identifies himself finally to his brothers. In chapter 46, we've got the generations of Jacob, and I'll mention more about the generation concept then. Chapter 47, the children of Israel are given the land of Goshen, which is part of the Nile Delta, the best property in Egypt. In chapter 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and we've got a situation here where the birthright thing is switched. And then chapter 49, Jacob gives a prophecy about his sons. He dies, finally. And then in chapter 50, Joseph dies. It all sets us up for the story that begins in Exodus then, of what happens to the children of Israel, because Exodus happens about 400 some years later. But the whole point of it in this part of Genesis, the second half of Genesis, not just God shaping his people, but in reality, when you start reading Exodus, how did they get to Egypt? That's the second half of Genesis. It gets the people to Egypt, and that's where they become slaves, largely because of chapter 47. They're given the best land. Pharaoh dies, And people began to question, why are these foreigners on the best land? And so they start to enslave them. So I've summarized a lot of this morning in the handout that you got, so that should help a little bit to navigate through all of this. The map of the Middle East, I mean, I've got the modern names of nations there. But for the most part, the story of Abraham and his family, his descendants, takes place in the southern part of what is today Israel, so around Hebron. Today, Hebron is actually in the occupied West Bank. It's not officially in Israel. But Hebron is sort of the space where Abraham and the family live. And the story that we're going through, these 9 chapters, actually details how the family moves from Canaan into Egypt. And that's where they get parked at the end of Genesis. And just to give you a satellite view, I'm not exactly sure back in Old Testament times how much people really understood sort of the geography of where they lived. I mean, today we can look at it with satellite. But when you do it with satellite, the land of Goshen on the left side, this part here is where the Suez Canal comes through. So this is Egypt on this side, and you can see the greenery. I mean, this is the delta region of the Nile, and this is where the children of Israel are given. And it's sort of the breadbasket for Egypt. And over time, for centuries or so, you can see why people would be a little bit, why are they there? So the distance between Hebron and the land of Goshen is roughly between 250 and 300 miles, depending on where you start the journey. And just to give you a view of what the land of Goshen it looks like a little bit, the Nile Delta is really pretty. It's very beautiful. So this is where they park themselves. Okay, on the handout today, starting with chapter 41, we've got 2 years have passed now, and Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. And you remember the dreams. I mean, the dreams are the 7 fat cattle who come out of the Nile River, and then you've got 7 scrawny, look like dying cattle that eat up the fat cattle. And then you've got a similar dream that he has where you've got 7, it appears to be like a stalk of corn, and on this one stalk there's 7 ears. I mean, that's bumper crop kind of thing. And then you've got this stalk that's got 7 ears that are really terrible shape, look like they're dying, and they gobble up the good ears. And the question that Pharaoh has is, what does the dreams mean? And as I mentioned last week, dreams mean something in Old Testament times. I mean, there is this belief, and it's not just on the Hebrew side, but there is this belief that the gods, small g, are talking to you. Some divine thing is talking to you through these dreams. I mean, I have a terrible time remembering dreams, but apparently they remember dreams quite well. And the question for Pharaoh was, what do the dreams mean? And he calls all of his counselors together, and they just can't figure it out. Which, to me, these 2 dreams aren't that difficult to understand, but it's the cupbearer, praise God, who after 2 years says, oh yeah, I remember. Back when I was in prison, when you threw me into prison, there was this guy who interpreted dreams. And so Pharaoh calls him in, and Joseph interprets the dreams. There's going to be 7 good years. There's going to be 7 years of famine. And he tells Pharaoh, you better find somebody now, because this is going to hit soon. You got to get started. And so I don't know if they put an ad out on LinkedIn or something. Can we find somebody? But whatever the case is, Pharaoh comes to the conclusion, Joseph, you're the guy. And what's odd about that is that Joseph's been in prison for a couple of years. He's a foreigner on top of that. And we find out here, starting in verse 41, a little bit about what Pharaoh has decided. And this is a guy who gets the keys to the city. I mean, he is second in command. So Pharaoh commissioned Joseph, I'm putting you in charge of the entire country of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his finger and slipped it on Joseph's hand, which is essentially passing authority on to this guy. Again, remember, he's a prisoner. He was a prisoner, and he's a foreigner. There's no question he's a foreigner. He outfitted him in the robes of best linen. I mean, it's the coat of many colors kind of thing again. And put a gold chain around his neck. He put the second-in-command chariot at his disposal. And as he rode, people shouted, "Bravo," which in Hebrew actually means, make way. Not only are they championing this guy, but here comes, the authority. And Joseph was in charge of the entire country of Egypt. Pharaoh told Joseph, "I am Pharaoh," which I think is a reminder to him, I'm still the boss. "But no one in Egypt will make a single move without your stamp of approval." Two things happen in this chapter that are important. One is that Joseph gets a new name. I mean, it is Zaphanatha-Paneah, which means God speaks and he lives. And I'm not sure that capital G is actually, the interpreters of the Bible tend to believe that they're talking about the Hebrew God, but I think it's just the fact that the gods live through this guy. And he also has given him an Egyptian wife. And it's interesting, the family relationship of his wife. Because not only is he given an Egyptian wife, Asenath, but the father is a priest. He's a priest in a pagan temple in On, which is Hierapolis, which is close to Cairo. It's just sort of fascinating, how this transformation happens all so rapidly. And intermarriage is not something that was approved in the book of Exodus. I mean, Exodus, it becomes very clear. You don't intermarry. Joseph does.
Think how idiotic this must have seemed to the average citizen, because none of this has happened, and here this guy is getting everything treated like royalty.
Yeah.
It's the biggest scam that ever existed.
Probably. Well, yes, and clearly the Egyptians must have, the common person, if Pharaoh says something, it must be, you do that. But it unfolds here. Joseph is 30 years old, so he's rather young. There's a bumper crop for 7 years. He puts the stores in the grain, or in the granaries. It's followed by 7 years of famine. It spreads beyond Egypt, so you've got this famine that sweeps over the Middle East. And he has 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Those are 2 important kids, because they will essentially, when they go back to settle into the promised land 400 some years later, Manasseh gets a huge swath of land, and so does and Ephraim. And they occupy a good chunk of what becomes the northern kingdom of Israel. So in chapter 42, Jacob sends 10 of his sons to Egypt for food. And he leaves Benjamin behind. He wants Benjamin to stay home. Now remember, Benjamin and Joseph come from the same mother, Rachel, which I believe actually was incredibly, of the 4 wives that Jacob has, it's clear he loved Rachel. And the tragedy, of course, was that Rachel died when Benjamin was born. So they need food. They go to Egypt to buy it. Benjamin is required to stay back because I don't think Jacob wants anything to happen to him. Joseph is managing the food distribution in this whole matter. When they come to Egypt, and it's not clear whether or not Joseph recognizes them and then sort of steps over into distributing food, so he has a direct relationship with these foreigners, or whether or not he was really just out there in front managing food. But you've got foreigners who are coming to Egypt now, wanting to buy food. They don't recognize him, which I think actually makes a lot of sense, because I think Joseph has been Egyptianized. If you see pictures of Egyptian folks, pretty much body hair is gone. They wear makeup, eye makeup and stuff. Joseph likely would have been speaking Egyptian. So when the brothers arrive, who would have thought? Joseph? But Joseph recognizes who they are. He asks where they come from. He accuses them of being spies, which actually makes some sense here too, because you've got foreigners coming into Egypt who have storehouses full of food, or you have people coming that are casing out the joint. So this sort of plays into this. He's playing this out, but it would make some sense of why they're grilling the foreigners. And what he does is that he requires, after he finds out that you've got a younger brother and he's back at home, You go back and you get him. You bring him here, because I want you to prove to me you're not spies. Which sets up this interesting thing where they take the brothers, they put the brothers in prison for 3 days. Again, numbers sort of mean something in the Bible. So a period of time. Simeon is the one who is going to, in the end, be held hostage. He's going to stay in prison, and they all have to return back to Canaan to get Benjamin and to bring him. So 9 of the brothers go back, and this is the rest of the chapter, beginning of verse 29. When they got back to their father Jacob, back in the land of Canaan, they told him everything that had happened, saying, "The man who runs the country spoke to us roughly and accused us of being spies." We told him, "We are honest men and in no way spies. There were 12 of us brothers, sons of one father. One is gone and the youngest is with our father in Canaan. But the master of the country said, 'Leave one of your brothers with me. Take food for your starving family and go, but bring back your youngest brother back to me, proving that you're honest men and not spies. And then I'll give your brother back to you, and you will be free to come and go to this country.' As they were emptying their food sacks, each man came on his purse of money." So what happened in this whole thing is that when they gave him the food that they bought, is that Joseph instructed that the money that they had paid get put back into their sacks of grain. And they didn't discover it until they got back and unloaded. This is going to be repeated. But they find out the money is in there a little bit quicker. As they were emptying their food sacks, each man came out in his purse. One seeing their money, they and their father were upset. Actually, in here the Hebrews, that it was grief. Because essentially, what have you done? This is like stealing food from the Egyptians. And will they come after us? Are they going to punish? And on top of that, they've got Simeon. Their father said to them, "You're taking everything I got. Joseph's gone, Simeon's gone, and now you want to take Benjamin. If you have your way, I'm not going to have anything left here. All the family will be gone." Reuben spoke up. "I'll put my 2 sons in your hands as hostages. If I don't bring Benjamin back, then you can sacrifice them." And Jacob says, "No." So in the end, you leave at the end of chapter 42, actually Jacob is saying, Simeon's in jail. Guess that's life. I'm going to lose another son. Chapter 43, though, the famine gets worse, much worse. So guys, you're going to have to go back to Egypt and buy more food. So Judah begs Jacob, and Judah will become where the bloodline comes for Jesus. But Judah is the one who begs Jacob to let him take Benjamin back. Let's get our brother. We need to get food, but let's also get Simeon. Let's go back and show them that Benjamin, we're not lying, we're not spies. So Jacob finally reluctantly agrees, but what he does tell the brothers is that you take the money back to the Egyptians that we found in the bags. And actually, it gets you a sense here of how wealthy Jacob must have been. What they lacked is food. They had money, they just didn't have the food. And so he says, you take the money back and you give it to them, but also take more money, let's double it. Plus, you're going to need some more money to buy the next round of food. I think, again, it gives you this sense of just how wealthy all of this is. So Joseph holds a big feast. When the brothers arrive, Joseph holds a big feast in his home, invited into his home. And the brothers are scared. Because what is this? Are you going to entrap us? Because the brothers are carrying this guilt. We sold our brother. And actually what they come up with is this idea that actually God's getting us. This is a payback from God because we sold our brother. And that's what's haunting them, I think, inside. So they tell Joseph's steward. They don't tell Joseph, but they tell the steward. We came and we bought food and we paid you and we went back home and we found this money in our bags. So here, take the money. We want to give the money to you. So this is what the rest of this chapter is about. The steward said in verse 23, everything's in order. Don't worry. Your God and the God of your father must have given you a bonus. He's rewarded you, so keep the money. Because I was paid in full. And clearly, he wasn't. Because the steward knows what's going on. That's what's sort of the interesting part of the story. And with that, he presented Simeon to them. So he brings the brother out of jail. So Joseph comes home. He asks them about their father. He's inquiring, is Jacob still alive? Joseph sees Benjamin and he loses it. I mean, this emotional moment where he sees this is his full brother. He's got other brothers, but this is the guy that came from Rachel. And I suspect that when Joseph was sold into slavery, Benjamin was really quite young. So now he is seeing him more as a grown man. So beginning with verse 30. Deeply moved on seeing his brother and about to burst into tears, Joseph hurried out into another room and had a good cry. Then he washed his face, got a grip on himself, and said, "Let's eat." Joseph was served at his private table, the brothers off by themselves and the Egyptians off by themselves. And oh, by the way, the parenthetical phrase here that Moses provides us is why that's happening. Because these guys are foreigners. And on top of that, they're shepherds. They work with livestock. That was not something the Egyptians liked. I mean, they had to have livestock. But like with the Jews, shepherds were sort of considered outcasts of society. I mean, Jews were like that as well, because they couldn't keep all the religious days, because they had to work. They were tending the sheep. That's why the sheep, when the angels come in Bethlehem and come to the shepherds out watching their flock at night, that is so significant, because it's the outcasts of society. I mean, you have to have the shepherds to care for the flock, but we really don't want to associate with them because they're sort of dirty.
And they're going to smell.
Well, they probably smell. The brothers were facing Joseph, arranged in the order by their age, which is sort of interesting that Joseph would do this. And oh, by the way, when the food comes, who gets the most? Benjamin. I mean, I think Joseph is sort of having some fun with all of this, but the reality is that, are the brothers going to be jealous? I mean, it's like the coat of many colors. So pile it on for Benjamin, and let's just see how the brothers react. Chapter 44. Joseph ordered his house steward, and the house steward in the story, clearly the steward knows what's going on here. He's got to have figured all of this out. And I have a feeling that Joseph probably was explaining it to the steward. These are my family. Let's play this out because they sold me into slavery. Joseph ordered his house steward, fill the men's bags with food, all they can carry, and replace each one's money at the top of the bag. Then put my chalice, my silver chalice, a symbol of his power, in the top of the bag of the youngest, along with the money for his food. Send him off. He did as Joseph ordered. At break of day, the men sort of set off on their donkeys. And unlike the last time when they got home and discovered it, they apparently were suspicious of what was happening this time. Because as they got out of town, apparently they must have checked the bags. Oh, yes, barely out of town when Joseph said to his house steward, "Run after them. When you catch up with them, say, 'Why did you pay me back evil for good? This is the chalice my master drinks from. He also used it for divination. This is outrageous.' He caught up with them and repeated all of his words word for word. And they said, 'What is my master talking about? We would never do anything like that.' 'Why? The money we found in our bags earlier, we've given back to you.' We were honest with you. Do you think that we're going to turn around and do the same thing again, stealing from Pharaoh himself in essence?" And so on the top of page 3, what the agreement is, you find the chalice in one of the bags, that person should die. And so the steward goes through all of the bags. And the way that the translation is, it's sort of the brothers are very arrogant about pulling the bags out and, look at mine. And what did they find? It's Benjamin. So the chalice shows up in Benjamin's bag. They're taken back to Joseph. They're interrogated. I suspect they were scared to death. Judah is the spokesman for the brothers, and what his conclusion is, I think God is punishing us. We're getting our punishment for having sold our brother. Verse 30. And now can't you see that if I show up before your servant, my father, without the brother, this son whom is his life is so bound up, the moment he realizes the boy is gone, he's going to die on the spot. So different from when they sold Joseph into slavery, is that they didn't value his life. When there is this spot now, Benjamin, they want to protect. And in fact, Dad would die if we come back without him. That's how valuable now Benjamin is to them. So chapter 45, at the top of page 3, Joseph couldn't hold himself in any longer, keeping up a front before all of his attendants. He cried out, "Leave, clear out, everyone leave." So there was no one with Joseph when he identified himself to his brothers, but his sobbing was so violent that the Egyptians could hear them. I mean, I think a lot of those buildings were fairly open anyway. The news was soon reported to Pharaoh's palace, and Joseph told his brothers, "I'm Joseph." And wouldn't you guess, they really wouldn't have much to say. I mean, this is a speechless moment. Really? Joseph? The guy we sold into slavery? And you got this much power in a foreign country? This is the story we want to hear. They couldn't believe that they were hearing and seeing. "Come closer to me," Joseph said to his brothers. They came closer. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But don't feel badly. Don't blame yourself for selling me." One of the most significant chapters in Genesis is this chapter 45, because Joseph has come to the conclusion God was behind it. God sent me here ahead of you to save lives. And in fact, your life. There has been a famine in the land now for 2 years. The famine is going to continue for 5 more years, neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me on ahead to pave the way and make sure there was a remnant in the land to save your lives in an amazing act of deliverance. So you see, it wasn't you who sent me here, but it was God. What an incredible conclusion this guy has made. I suppose, for Joseph being second in command, life looks a little bit different now. If he would have been in prison, I'm not sure that, and going through sort of the harder times of whether or not that conclusion would have been easier reached. But he has come to the conclusion, God's been guiding all of this. And there's an application in our daily lives. That sometimes we may have to go through some really challenging stuff. Is it all part of God's plan? He set me in place as a father to Pharaoh, but put me in charge of his personal affairs and made me ruler of all Egypt. And so he says to the brothers, you go back and you get your father. Bring the family. And in fact, we're going to give you the best land, a spot in Goshen. You're going to be owners of it. Part of the Nile Delta. And it sets up the stage. That decision to give Jacob's family this prized piece of area on the Nile Delta sets up the stage for Exodus. And it takes a while for the animosity of the Egyptians to turn on the Hebrews, on the Jews. But it does come. And partly because you've got almost this separate nation that's on our property and the best land. Pharaoh's gone, so we don't know the story anymore. And they become enslaved. And that's where then Moses has to rise up and lead the people out. And it will come here in as we get farther into Genesis toward the end, there is a recognition that eventually while you guys are moving here, this is temporary, you will be going back. That's actually part of the prophecy that I think Jacob and Joseph both understand.
I think from the archaeology and the study of the Egyptian pharaohs, what happens is when the switch happens, it's a whole different dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
It takes over.
Yep. Pharaoh dies. That ends wherever that moment in time is in that family history. Is that you've got a new group in town. And they are oblivious to what has all taken place. In fact, they probably really don't care. These are foreigners. And why are they there? Chapter 46. So the family packs up, they move to Egypt. God speaks to Jacob in a dream. This is sort of the prediction that's sort of interesting in verse 3 and 7. God said, I am the God of your father. Don't be afraid of going down to Egypt. Remember, he's told the family before, don't go to Egypt. But it's okay to go to Egypt. I'm going to make you a great nation there. I'll go with you down to Egypt, but I'm also going to bring you back home. So there is this promise that you're going to go there temporarily. I don't think there was any imagination that it was going to be for centuries. But like with God, I mean, God doesn't have a clock. And when you die, Joseph will be with you. With his own hand, he'll close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba. Israel's sons loaded their father and the little ones and their wives, and Pharaoh had provided the wagons, and they all pack up and they go to Egypt. And they settle into this new territory. I put it out here, there's 10 generations. When you look in the book of Genesis, there's actually 10 generations. Families that are identified as generations. The first one doesn't make a lot of sense because it's the generations of heaven and earth. But there are 10 generations. So chapter 5 has a generation of Adam. Chapter 6 of Genesis, Noah. The sons of Noah, Shem, Terah. Esau we had in chapter 36. This is number 10. This is Jacob's generations. They arrive in Egypt. Joseph is reunited with Jacob. Very emotional. And that little stretch there of verses 31 through 34, this is sort of this interesting moment where when Joseph welcomes the brothers sort of to their new home, he's saying, when you meet Pharaoh, and likely you're going to, explain to him that you've been shepherds all your life. This is your job. This is your career. Because, by the way, the Egyptians really don't like people working with livestock. And that's and it's just sort of this interesting that the Egyptians are looking down on these individuals essentially coming in, and they've got to explain themselves. This is our career. This is what. So when Pharaoh finds out about all of this, he's actually okay with it, and in fact he suggests to Joseph maybe they might want to help our folks who walk livestock. I mean, it's sort of this interesting okay. And in fact, Pharaoh must be so enamored by Joseph and the family. I mean, he really bends a lot of sort of the rules to bring this, because he's so impressed, I think, with Joseph. So chapter 47, Joseph introduces some of the brothers to Pharaoh, and they do the explanation. Oh, we're shepherds. We're shepherds. And in fact, what Joseph, if you read what Joseph, in the sort of this previous chapter at the very end, what I put there, I put it in bold and red. One of the reasons that Joseph, I think, is raising this whole idea of being, our family are shepherds, they work with livestock, is that maybe by putting you in this land of Goshen, that you're actually going to be separated from the rest of Egypt. They really won't want to deal with you. And so let's follow through with this shepherd story. Be honest about that. But Pharaoh will be more likely to put you off in the corner. So he introduces Jacob to Pharaoh. Jacob is 130 years old. Contrary to what I put here, he dies when he is 147, not 148. I must have had a late night that night. Joseph gives them sort of this land of Goshen, and they actually become owners of part of that. The famine is very severe, so severe, apparently, that Pharaoh buys up the property, buys up the farms of the Egyptians. And as a trade, they get seed, and they sort of become, almost like in medieval times. No, because those folks are separate. But the ones that lived on farms in the rest of Egypt, they buy up all the farms. And the people are okay with that because they view that as being saved. That you're giving us seed. We can still eat. So chapter 48. Chapter 48, this interesting blessing that takes place. We know Jacob's getting old. Joseph has 2 kids, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Joseph brings his two sons to Jacob to see them, and essentially for a blessing. Beginning in verse 3, Jacob said to Joseph, the strong God. And in this translation, the Message translation, whenever Peterson uses this phrase, the strong God or strong God, he's using the Hebrew word El Shaddai. And El Shaddai means powerful God. There's a lot of different names that describe God in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. This one, the El Shaddai one, is significant because this is powerful God. This is Almighty God. This is the God of the universe. That he can arrange it, he can build it. This same terminology for God is used when God comes to Abraham and gives him the blessing, originally. It happens when that blessing is repeated to Isaac, to Jacob, and now here again. This is significant. This is Almighty God talking to somebody. I'm going to make, and this is God talking to him, you prosper and numerous. Turn you into a congregation of tribes, and I'll turn this land over to your children coming after you as a permanent inheritance. I'm adopting your two sons, who were born to you here in Egypt before I joined you. They have equal status with Reuben and Simeon. So your sons, I'm going to add into the family. I mean, that was incredible for Jacob, because what Jacob is essentially doing, they're in the will now. So when I die, they're going to have something to take care of them. And then right after this, it says, oh, if you have other kids, I'm not taking care of them. But I'm going to take care of Manasseh and Ephraim. That's what the rest of that says. And the reason I'm going to do it, because of Rachel. I mean, you read between the lines, he loves Rachel so much, probably still misses her. I mean, she died. But I'm going to take care of the kids. So the blessing mix-up that takes place here. We've been through this before, the birthright issue. Bring them to me, Jacob said, so I can bless them. And of course, we know Jacob is partially blind, if not totally blind. Beginning in verse 12. Joseph took them from Israel's knees and bowed respectfully. He faced the two boys, Ephraim with his right hand, setting him on Jacob's left knee, and Manasseh with his left hand, setting him on Israel's right knee, and stood them before him. But Israel, Jacob, can remember Jacob's name has changed to Israel, crossed his arms and puts his hands just the opposite way. So Israel crossed his arms and put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, the firstborn. And then he blessed them. This is the blessing. The God before whom walked my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long, to this very day, the angels who delivered me from every evil, bless the boys. May my name be echoed in their lives and the names of Abraham, Isaac, and my fathers, and may they grow, covering the earth with their children. I mean, may you be abundantly blessed. When Joseph saw this, that is what his father had done, placing his hands in reverse order, he thought he had made a mistake. And so he grabs Dad's hand and moves it around. I mean, maybe you can't see Dad. You got this mixed up here. Verse 19. But his father wouldn't do it. He said, I know, my son. I know what I'm doing. And he also will develop into people, and he also will be great. I mean, he's talking about Manasseh, but it's his younger brother that will actually grow to become greater. I mean, it's as though Jacob has this view into the future and decides, I mean, it's God's guidance to that actually Manasseh, the firstborn, isn't really going to be the one that's going to be incredibly blessed. It's really your second son, Ephraim. And so he blesses him. And that's exactly how it works out in history. The tribe of Ephraim actually is always larger than Manasseh, and Manasseh gets the most land. Israel then said to Joseph, I'm about to die. God be with you and give you safe passage back to the land of your fathers. As for me, I'm presenting you as the first among your brothers, and the ridge of land I took from the Amorites with you. I mean, you get a little bit more there. Chapter 49 is an odd chapter. I'm not going to read it, but I gave it to you here if you want to go through it. This is a prophecy, it seems as though, that Jacob is essentially blessing each of the sons, sort of in this last act. I'm ready to die. Let me share with you what I see coming. And when you read this, well, we can read actually the Reuben one, because that's Reuben is the firstborn. So Reuben really should have been one who would have, you take the family and move forward. Not according to Jacob's prophecy. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my strength, first proof of my manhood, at the top in honor and at the top in power. But like a bucket of water spilled, you will be at the top no more. Because you climbed into your father's marriage bed. Goes back to Genesis 35. 35. This was incest. Mounting that couch, and you defiled it. Simeon, Levi, remember, those are the two guys that when Dinah, the daughter, is raped at Shechem, that they decide, they do the setup with the whole circumcision thing, but they go in and it's mass murder. If you look on page 6, the longest blessing comes with Judah in the middle of the bottom left column. And the other one is Joseph on the other side, the middle of the right column. To that, Jacob is predicting or prophesying, you will be blessed. On page 7 at the top, all these are the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes. That's what becomes the family. And this is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each one with his own special farewell blessing. I'm not sure that some of them would have been all that excited to hear it, because it seems as though what he is doing is peering into the future, and this is sort of what's going to happen to your clan. And some of it isn't particularly very uplifting. Joseph's request, when I die, take me home. Take me back to be buried with Abraham and Sarah and the family in the cave. Verse 33, Jacob finished instructing his sons, pulled his feet into bed, and died. Age 47, again, not 48 there. So we've come to chapter 50, the tail end. Joseph had Jacob embalmed. And wouldn't you expect that in Egypt, right? They're embalming all the important people, so they embalmed Jacob. 40 days it takes them to do that. The Egyptians had publicly mourned Jacob's death for 70 days, which is incredible. Joseph asked Pharaoh to permit him to take his father back to Canaan for burial. Not only does Pharaoh agree to it, but actually all the high officials in Egypt go in this big funeral processional entourage. They don't go into Canaan. They sort of stop there. And the family goes in for a private burial. But that's the kind of respect that Joseph has in Egypt with Pharaoh. And so at the bottom of that left column on page 7, when everybody comes back, because the brothers and the family, they come back to Egypt because the famine's still going on, is that the brothers are worried. Dad's gone. Joseph's going to get us. And so they come up with this story. Joseph, Dad said that you're supposed to forgive us. And when you read chapter 50, actually it's sort of this, Joseph is really sort of saddened that his brothers would have thought that. That's sort of interesting about Joseph. So the brothers, they come, they fall down in front of Joseph, prostrate themselves, which means they fell down on the ground. You are the leader. And this goes back, remember the dream that Joseph started out with. The brothers, you're going to bow to me. There it is, chapter 50. It happened. And I, do the brothers actually realize, what? Do you remember back, guys, when I told you about this dream? I don't think Joseph sort of rubs their face in it. But beginning in verse 19 then, Joseph replied, don't be afraid. Do I act for God? Don't you see, you planned evil against me, but God used those same plans for my good. As you see all around you right now, you're being saved because of God's actions and of using me. Just incredible insight that Joseph has. Easy now, you have nothing to fear. I'll take care of you and your children. He reassured them, speaking with them heart to heart. Joseph continued to live in Egypt with his father's family. Joseph lived 110 years. He lived to see Ephraim's sons and to the third generation, so not just the grandkids, but the great-great-grandchildren. So he ruled in Egypt. His power seems to be about 80 years. This is significant. Verse 24, at the end, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm ready to die. God will most certainly pay you a visit and take you out of this land, back to the land he so solemnly promised us, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Again, who would have known it would have been 4 centuries that it will take? Then Joseph made the sons of Israel promise under oath, when I die, and you go back home, take my bones with you. That actually will come true in Joshua. It takes a little while for all of this to happen. But what happens is that Joseph is embalmed. He is put into a coffin. You can imagine, again, the Egyptian style for the higher ups. Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him. Of course, it's in Egypt. Placed him in a coffin in Egypt. It will, and I put in here, this is the verse out of Exodus 12, verse 40, just to give context. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. So the family that's there, while they may have thought they're going home soon, it takes a number of centuries for that to take place. But isn't that God? He doesn't really have a clock. God will do it. It may not be in our lifetime. So that's all 50 chapters of Genesis. It's a fascinating story. The Joseph part of it is really quite uplifting and almost comical in some sense. Because I think Joseph may not have been vengeful, but he is squeezing out of this a little bit of joy, I think, I want to see, do the brothers care for the rest of the brothers? Particularly the young boy, Benjamin. And he does see that. And the brothers clearly have remorse. There seems to be a confession that takes place between them and their brother. We are sorry. Well, then it would be easy to say now because you're in charge and you're feeding us. Okay, and we got the best land. But it's Joseph's insight into this whole thing that really is amazing. How often in our lives when we go through really tough, miserable times, is this part of the God's plan? And that in it, in the end, his will is going to be accomplished. Joseph saw that and raises it a couple of times in the tail end. So what do we learn from Genesis? The whole story, from the creation all the way to the very end. Jim?
What's amazing about this is Joseph picked all this up without going to church every Sunday, having the Torah to read. Somehow God spoke to him. He would see it. And he spoke to him more clearly than we're spoken to.
Yeah, it does appear, I think, in many parts of the Old Testament that the relationship between some of the key characters and God seems to be quite intimate. We're sort of predating any formal worship that's taking place. And in the midst of a pagan society, because the Egyptians worshipped, among all of the gods, they worshipped the sun. They believe that was, there's a whole Re or Ra, whatever you want to call him, is the god. And in the midst of all of that, Joseph seems to be developing this strong relationship with God, big G. The Jews become sort of a witness to the people around them. I mean, I think for a lot of folks, the Hebrews, the Jews, I mean, they're an odd group. They're foreigners. They've got their God. Our gods are more powerful and stuff. But you've got a guy like Joseph and Jacob to some degree, because we've seen growth in Jacob. And we see growth in really all of the main characters. But Joseph has come to this incredible moment in time, given all that he went through, all of the misery that he goes through. It's all part of God's plan. And I'm okay with that.
I'd like to hear your take on all these missteps of inheritance that seem to be an ongoing theme in Genesis.
It does seem to be that, the way that human beings have it planned out. I mean, this is sort of the cultural thing. God intervenes. And in the end, this is what I want. This is the best route. That if you go the route that you think you need to follow, it's not going to have the same kind of outcome. I think it's God's intervention into a family that in some respects, if you go back to Isaac and the group, is somewhat dysfunctional. I'm not sure that they're clearly listening to God, and that at times he's got to intervene. Like with Jacob giving the blessing to Manasseh and Ephraim, which actually isn't hugely significant. Because while they have inheritance rights now, the bloodline to Jesus isn't going to them. And in fact, they will, in the Civil War, that family will they'll be on the north. That's the one that implodes first. So I think this birthright thing is God's intervention into people's lives and saying, no, you may want it this way, but this is the way it's got to be.
One step further, what's our application for a New Testament church with that lesson? How do we apply that inheritance theme?
Well, I mean, it seems as though what's happening in the second half of Genesis with Abraham all the way through is it's the need to listen to God more intensely. That the best plans that humans tend to draw up may not be the best way to go. And how do you test that out? I see in the inheritance situation this whole firstborn stuff, and God sort of, I mean, even, Jacob's messing around with the inheritance with Esau, is that God's will, God's plan is this. And how do we really understand it, discover it, see it? And a lot of times as human beings, we can't very clearly see it. God's got to inject stuff at times. I think in our lives today as Christians, I've got ideas of the way I want my life to unfold. And quite honestly, it hasn't gone that way. And at times I've been really mad and really angry. And, you could have done it differently. You didn't. And yet, as you get old, like I think Jacob and Joseph and some do, when you look back,
My favorite is him wrestling with the angel. That sums it up.
yeah. Well, and I think, the wrestling with the angel or, whatever God or whoever, the divine presence there, to me actually was a statement to Jacob that you're stronger than you believe you are. So buck up, hang on to me, and I'll get you through. There's lessons that happen there, I think. Isn't that part of our lives where sometimes we have to have the lessons that occur because we've got things mapped out. We know what we want, and in the end, no. God's direction is this way. And I think for New Testament Christians, it's a challenge then of how do we see that direction? Because it's not, it would be great if he dropped notes from heaven on us, or if he, how about some dreams? Who's the dreamers today that's getting direct, connection with God? Somebody coming into Zion and say, boy, did I have a dream last night? And God has told us we're going to go this way. And we've had those people in society who've said that. And they get blown off. Maybe God is speaking that way. I don't know. But so often, I think in life, we've got the plans. And that's not necessarily God's. And so he's got to come in and tweak them. He's got to come in and intervene. So lessons learned from Genesis. What do we take away from Genesis? Yeah, clearly God's in charge, isn't it? Yeah.
He uses flawed people.
Yes, he does use flawed people. I mean, the reality is that you've got, if anything, as Moses tells the story, he could have whitewashed it. He doesn't. Abraham has his moments. Isaac has his moments. Jacob has his moments. Joseph has his moments. The children of Israel have their moments. I mean, when they leave Egypt to head back to the promised land. And you'd think after these 10 incredible miracles that take place, that they would, God's with us. You get out in the desert and they're complaining to Moses, we don't have steak to eat anymore. I mean, the food is terrible. God's abandoned us. Just take us back.
And now you put us out there in this
To die.
army is going
To
to
die.
wipe us out.
To die, yeah.
You see the pillar of fire, and how do you not,
God's presence. Yeah. Well, and Moses goes up and, to get the 10 Commandments, and what did they do? Well, Moses is dead. Let's build something to worship. And let's build something that we're probably seeing back in Egypt. I mean, let's go to another god. And it's the flawed people.
For 40 years, the clothes did not wear out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the manna and the quail and stuff is that, why aren't you connecting the dots, guys? And so many don't. I mean, it's not that everybody's that way. I mean, we know that there's some faithful ones in the group. But there's an awful lot, and I think it's more of the majority, who just do not connect dots. And you think, how stupid can some of these people be? And yet I have a feeling if we were trading places, we probably wouldn't be much different, because we're sinners.
In our own ways, we probably still do it here.
Probably, yeah.
The other thing I see is our human understanding and our human expectations are not God's.
Mm-hmm.
In our,
Frequently they aren't, yeah.
in our human expectations, we would think Jesus to come from Joseph's line.
Yes. Yep. If you look on the back, I printed out there's a map on the back here. When the children of Israel go back to Canaan to settle, this is how the family tribes are divided up land-wise. I mean, you can see Manasseh. Manasseh's got an incredibly large section of land. Remember, that is Joseph's kid. So Manasseh's got land on both. I mean, that's huge. But they don't have a lot of people. The two tribes that survive, the northern kingdom, well, let me go to the next. This is how it will end up in the Old Testament. When Solomon dies and the nation ends up in civil war and splits into north and south, the northern tribes will become the nation of Israel. So Manasseh, all those folks. There's only two tribes that stay essentially faithful to God in the south, and that's Benjamin and Judah. That's the line through which Jesus will come through. The northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. The southern kingdom in red is destroyed by the Babylonians because, it takes a little bit longer. They aren't as faithful either over time. But that map that you've got back there, that's how the family is divided up. Joseph doesn't get any land. His land comes through Manasseh and Ephraim. Levi, they don't get any land. They become the priests. So that's how they get sort of divided up into territory. Genesis is a fascinating book. It's just, Dr. Meisner did a great job, I think, of setting the stage in understanding from the beginning standpoint, what are the foundational things that Genesis tells us up to Abraham? What do we learn there? Significant stuff, particularly about the sinfulness of man. And then we see it play out in a family. And yet God's faithful in the first half, he's faithful in the second half.
I think what we have to accept the fact is that God is into all the details. I think back to our first adoption. Through Lutheran Social Services, we We'd only been approved in September. And the next month, they called us up and said, can you pick them up tomorrow? And we were both going, what happened to 9 months, you know? And then that same child ends up with a brain tumor. And he needed special parents to get him through it. So God was in the details. And every family is dysfunctional, it's just we can't see it.
Or maybe we don't want to see it sometimes. Yeah. Yeah, and I think so often in our lives, we want quick solutions, I believe, for the most part.
Yes.
You know, that particularly in the society we live today, you know, that you can press a button, you could Google something, you can get an answer. God's time is just very, very different. And when you look at the fact that the children of Israel, it takes 430 some years for them finally to get back home, okay, God doesn't have a clock. Steve?
I think one of the lessons I took from Genesis as a whole is God allowed man to make his choices, but God's not bound by man's choices. So God is going to fulfill his plan one way or the other. And throughout the whole book, you see humans trying to get God to get on their page.
Yeah.
And God is
You know, you say,
trying to teach
this,
them, no,
this,
you need to get on my page.
this is the page. Yeah, you're going to find. And guys, we're actually going to do this in the end. We can do it the easy way. We can do it the hard way.
So whether you get blessed or cursed, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'm still going to do what I want.
Yeah, Genesis is clearly God's will is done.
Yeah.
It just, there's some uneven road there.
Yeah, I see so many parallels between Joseph and David. And yet, Joseph is like written out of the tribes, and David is elevated, of course, through him comes the Messiah. But it's so strange to me, all the good, all the bad that happened to Joseph, same with David, all the good that Joseph did and became, and yet he's not in the
Yeah, there's some scholars, commentators and stuff who see Joseph as sort of an archetype of Jesus. You know, that Joseph and Jesus have similarities in terms of being cast out and rejected, and yet they save. Because Joseph saves the family. And yet in history, I mean, David becomes the great hero. I mean, certainly, and certainly not David has a lot of moments. I mean, the Bathsheba moment is not good. But yeah, Joseph, it is interesting because if you're reading Genesis, you think, well, Jesus is going to come out of Joseph's line because look at this guy. He saved the people. No, it's going to be Judah. All right, interesting study. We're done with this, all 50 chapters. Thank you for leading us through it. No.